During a family photo session, he sat alone on the side watching with a forlorn look. Noticing the boy's loneliness, his foster mother ignored the family's objections and invited him to join the photo. Clumsily, he squeezed into the back row, and with the camera's click, he felt the warmth of a family for the first time. Just days before, Michael was homeless, wandering around surviving on discarded popcorn from the basketball courts. Always carrying a plastic bag with his only change of clothes, he spent his nights wherever he could find shelter, often hiding in laundromats to stay warm. One chilly early winter evening, as he walked alone, the Toohey family drove by. Their youngest son recognized him as Michael from school. Mrs. Toohey was puzzled by his scant clothing in the cold. Her husband stopped to ask Michael where he was headed, and after hearing he was going to the gym, which was out of their way, they initially drove off. Sensing something wasn't right, Mrs. Toohey urged her husband to turn back, knowing the gym would be closed. Upon catching up, she asked Michael why he was heading there, and he confessed it was warmer at night. When asked if he had a place to sleep, Michael hesitantly nodded and shook his head under her stern gaze. Realizing he had nowhere to go, Mrs. Toohey looked at her husband, who immediately understood her intention. Soon, Michael was in their car heading to their home. His eyes widened in awe as they approached their lavish mansion, a sight he had never seen before. Like in previous foster homes, Michael was given the couch in the living room to sleep on. Mrs. Toohey carefully laid out the sheets and then went upstairs, suddenly regretting their decision, fearing they knew too little about him and the risk of theft. Her husband calmly reassured her, suggesting that they would soon know. The next morning, Mrs. Toohey, anxious, came downstairs only to be stunned. Not only was the blanket neatly folded, but nothing was missing from the room. Michael had already left, considerate not to overstay. Ashamed of her doubts, Mrs. Toohey hurriedly called him back as he was about to leave. Learning he had nowhere to go, she invited him to stay for Thanksgiving. When the feast was ready, the family eagerly gathered around. Michael approached hesitantly, receiving a plate from his sister. While everyone picked their favorites, he modestly added some fried rice and vegetables to his plate and sneakily stuffed a bread roll into his pocket, fearful of eating too much and facing the family's disdain. While the family relaxed on the couch watching TV and enjoying snacks, Michael sat alone at the dining table nibbling on dry bread. Touched by his modesty, Mrs. Toohey turned off the TV with the remote and moved all the food to the dining table. A proper celebration is in order, Mrs. Toohey declared, prompting everyone to join hands for a prayer before eating. His sister extended her hand to Michael without hesitation, and with a gentle nudge from his brother, Michael shyly reached out his large, bashful hands. Surrounded by the Toohey family, Michael celebrated his first Thanksgiving. After the meal, Mrs. Toohey planned to buy Michael some winter clothes, but he insisted he didn't need any, claiming he had enough. Knowing he only had the t-shirt in his bag, she pulled the car over to try to learn more about his life, who looked after him, and who he lived with. But Michael remained silent. Patiently, Mrs. Toohey asked him to share something about himself. Michael softly admitted that he disliked the nickname Big Mike as it made him feel like a clumsy giant. Mrs. Toohey promised to stop using it, and they drove to a predominantly black neighborhood to retrieve his clothes. As Mrs. Toohey prepared to step out of the car, Michael quickly locked the doors and insisted she stay inside due to the area's known chaos and danger. He greeted some locals and went to retrieve his belongings, only to find a government eviction notice on the door. His mother had been displaced again, whereabouts unknown. Michael returned visibly distressed, having found nothing. Understanding the situation, Mrs. Toohey took him straight to a store to buy clothes. She felt uneasy walking through the unfamiliar neighborhood, but Michael reassured her, "Don't worry, I'm here." Relieved, Mrs. Toohey linked arms with Michael as they entered a plus-size clothing store. He politely declined her choice of expensive new clothes, instead opting for a more affordable, discounted item. That evening, Mrs. Toohey asked Michael if he wanted to stay with them permanently. "I don't want to go anywhere else," he replied. Pleased, she made space for him the next day, buying him a large bed suitable for his height. Michael was in disbelief, asking, "Is this really for me?" Mrs. Toohey, thinking he was referring to the room, realized he meant the bed, something he had never had before. Overwhelmed with emotion, she excused herself, hiding her tears in the next room. Reflecting on his rough childhood, she made a decision to officially adopt him, offering him a true warm home. When the society ladies heard of her plans to adopt a big black boy, they laughed scornfully, joking about his appetite and warning her about her daughter's safety. Mrs. Toohey sternly retorted, "I'm not asking for your opinion." The gathering ended on a sour note. Although she appeared unaffected, Mrs. Toohey harbored some worries. That night, she sought her daughter's opinion about adopting Michael. Her daughter said she would respect her mother's decision, but her expression clearly showed her unhappiness. However, seeing Michael gently pushing the swings for her younger siblings, their joyful laughter changed her perspective. At the library, the sight of his large frame initially drew stares from classmates, prompting Michael to sit alone in a corner to avoid causing his sister any embarrassment. Ignoring her friend's curious looks, his sister joined him with her books, comforting him by saying, "Don't look so puzzled, it's just like doing homework at home." This gesture made Michael feel a warm sense of belonging. Gradually, the whole family accepted Michael. They would sit together in the library, reading and laughing like a true family. Learning that Michael had never heard bedtime stories, Mrs. Toohey took to reading them to him with the patience of a mother, while he listened intently, soaking in the childhood he never had. Even the father changed Michael's emergency contact at school to himself. Reviewing Michael's school records, Mrs. Toohey discovered that despite his towering height and weight, his IQ was only 80, equivalent to that of a 6-year-old. However, one of his tests showed an unusually high score in protective instincts. Michael's admission to this predominantly white school was largely thanks to the football coach, who noticed noticed his exceptional agility despite his size. Whether dribbling a basketball or making a jump shot, Michael performed flawlessly, impressing the coach who felt like he had found a gem. In football, the most crucial player is the quarterback, and protecting the quarterback is the primary job of the left tackle. The sport often relies on physical collisions, requiring the tackle to be not only large but also have wide hips, thick legs, long arms, large hands, and agile movements. Michael perfectly met these physical requirements. Although his academic skills were lacking and his IQ low, the physical education teacher advocated for him to stay, despite his physical advantages turning into a disadvantage in football due to his reluctance to collide with teammates out of kindness. During training, instead of tackling, he would either throw his teammates in the air or pick them up and run, which, while effective, were fouls. Furthermore, Michael struggled to understand football rules and tactics. The coach candidly stated that if Michael could tap into his potential, he could go to college and become a star. But if he continued as he was, even graduating would be challenging. To help Michael grasp football skills faster, his brother created a detailed training plan. Michael was eager to follow, starting with basic sit-ups and running back and forth on the field. He progressed to more complex drills, using his brother as a weight for running and treating household items like spice jars as teammates to practice tactics. One day, Michael approached Mrs. Toohey with a cautious request for a driver's license. Puzzled, Mrs. Toohey asked why he needed one without owning a car. She was stunned to learn he wanted it merely as a form of identification. Mrs. Toohey took Michael to search for any official documentation, but they found none proving his legal identity. With his 18th birthday approaching and legal adoption offering limited benefits, Mrs. Toohey still decided to pursue the necessary legal processes to secure his identity. The next day at the adoption center, Mrs. Toohey learned more about Michael's past. He had never met his father, and his mother, who had many children and battled addiction, had largely neglected him. Michael had moved through over a dozen foster homes, often relegated to the couch due to his size and the amount of food he consumed, which led many foster parents to regret taking him in. Frequent arguments over his presence signaled to Michael it was time to move on, shaping his reserved nature. Returning home, the Tooheys held a family meeting to ask if Michael wanted to officially join their family. Seeing the affirmative looks from his siblings, he responded, "I think I already am." Soon after, not only did Michael receive his first legal ID, but his adoptive parents also gifted him a stylish pickup truck. Excited about his new truck, Michael took his brother for a joyride, singing and dancing in the vehicle, oblivious to the road ahead. Suddenly, they crashed into another car. Mrs. Toohey was initially confused to see her son covered in blood but unharmed, until she noticed Michael's arms badly wounded from shielding his brother from the deploying airbag. It became clear there was no miracle, it was all Michael's quick reflexes. He had instinctively used his arms to absorb most of the airbag's impact, preventing a tragedy. Seeing Michael's selfless act to protect his family, and knowing his hesitation to engage aggressively in football, Mrs. Toohey suddenly had an idea. She briskly walked into the practice field in her high heels. "This team is your family now, and you need to protect them and stop others just like you would at home," she explained, indicating the team, including his siblings and father, were part of the crowd he must protect. Michael finally grasped what Mrs. Toohey meant, while his teammates looked on in bewilderment. Michael transformed into a formidable force on the football field, his immense stature and swift moves proving impenetrable to opponents. Soon he was ready for his first official football game. Facing a large audience for the first time, Michael was initially hesitant. As the game's score widened and during a block he accidentally fell, provoking an opponent who called him a fool and kicked him in the head. This infuriated the coach, who argued with the referee and was subsequently shown a yellow card. The coach became even more upset, declaring, "This boy is part of my team and I will protect him like my own child." He was about to confront the referee further when Michael stopped him.
"Don't worry, coach. I got your back."
Recalling Mrs. Toohey's words to protect his teammates like family, Michael's resolve reignited. As play resumed, he grabbed the offending player by the collar and relentlessly pushed forward, earning cheers from his coach and amazement from the crowd who had never seen such ferocity. Michael didn't let go until he had scored for his team. He pushed the rival player off the field, dominating subsequent blocks with ease. After several powerful collisions, the opponent limped off the field, defeated. Michael's team celebrated a resounding victory. His brother captured the highlights on video and sent DVDs to various colleges. Even seasoned college coaches were impressed by Michael's raw talent, remarking on his natural fit for football. The next morning, numerous coaches, including some who had won Super Bowl titles, rushed to his school. Still skeptical of Michael's prowess as shown in the video, a live demonstration was arranged. Coaches watched in awe as Michael instantly downed a comparable-sized player, prompting them to scramble to recruit him, pending his academic eligibility. Back home, the Tooheys reviewed Michael's academic record, which was poor. To qualify for college, he would need to excel in his final year. Despite this, over 50 colleges had extended offers. Not wanting to miss this opportunity, Mrs. Toohey hired a professor from the University of Mississippi to tutor Michael. The professor proved effective, making subjects understandable and significantly boosting Michael's interest in learning. In his final year of high school, Michael was busy both academically, with the professor's tutoring, and athletically, continuing in regular football games. To secure an early commitment, coaches visited Michael at his home, offering increasingly lucrative terms, each hoping he would choose their school. The frequent visits nearly wore out the doorstep, and his brother acted like Michael's agent, carefully vetting each coach's offer. By the end of his final school year, not only had Michael achieved excellent academic results, but he had also led his team to a football championship. After discussions, interviews, and deliberations, he chose to attend the University of Mississippi. Just as the family was envisioning a bright future, representatives from the Collegiate Athletic Association arrived with concerns. The association suspected that the Tuohy's adoption of Michael was a scheme, noting that both Mrs. Tuohy and her husband were alumni and significant donors to the University of Mississippi. They alleged that the Tuohys had targeted Michael for his football talents from the start, with the intention of placing him at Mississippi once he qualified academically. These allegations caused Michael to doubt the genuineness of the Tuohy's affection for him. As he nervously rubbed his legs, he wondered if all their kindness had been an act. His suspicion grew and he abruptly left the room. When Michael confronted Mrs. Tuohy again, he was full of accusations, feeling betrayed by not knowing their supposed ulterior motives until the association intervened. After venting his frustration, he stormed off, leaving a bewildered Mrs. Tuohy to question if their actions had unfairly constrained him. Her husband comforted her, suggesting that as long as their conscience was clear, they should let Michael make his own decisions going forward. Meanwhile, Michael returned to the black community. His old friends took him to a bar where the rough talk made him uncomfortable. However, when they began joking disrespectfully about his adoptive mother and sister, Michael's anger flared. Ignoring the gun some held, he knocked one to the ground and taught the group a lesson. It was then he realized that he truly regarded the Tuohy family as his kin. Mrs. Tuohy searched for Michael into the next day, driving through the dangerous parts of the black community. She even went to the bar he had visited the night before to ask if he had been there. When the beaten-up gang members insulted her, she lost her patience and threatened them, declaring her readiness to defend herself as a member of the National Rifle Association. Showing her concealed carry permit and confidently patting her shoulder bag, the gang members backed down. Just as Mrs. Tuohy returned to her car, Michael called her phone.
Mama?
This was the first time Michael called Mrs. Tuohy Mom. She found him at a laundromat where they sat down for a heartfelt conversation. Mrs. Tuohy asked how he managed to remain kind-hearted despite growing up in poverty. Michael shared that his mother used to make him close his eyes during troubling times, shielding him from drugs and other harmful sights. She would only let me open my eyes when the bad times had passed, Michael explained. She instilled in me the belief that the world is a good place and that the past is behind us, promising that things will get better. Mrs. Tuohy reflected, I never asked if you actually like playing football. Michael responded, I play pretty well. Mrs. Tuohy assured him, if you choose Tennessee, your father and I will cheer for you just as eagerly. We'll attend every game, no matter which school you choose. Even if you ended up not playing football and chose a different path, it's your life to decide, and I'll be happy for you. Hearing this, Michael genuinely smiled, feeling reassured about his choice of school. The next day, Michael met with the Athletic Association officials and explained his decision to choose the University of Mississippi. It's where my family went to school, where my mom and dad are from, so that's where I want to be. The officials smiled, satisfied, knowing this was Michael's true feeling. On the first day of college, Mrs. Tuohy was visibly tense, much like any mother sending her child off to school, filled with joy yet reluctant to let go. After giving Michael some last-minute advice, she hurriedly got into her car. Sensing her emotion, Michael tapped on the car window and asked for a hug. She stepped out and embraced him warmly, both of them sharing a moment of genuine affection and support. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this.